Shayla, a young pregnant black woman, boarded a crowded city bus hoping for a moment of kindness in her exhausting day. Instead, she faced a shocking act of cruelty. Jared Thompson, a successful executive, sneered at her request for his seat, his words dripping with prejudice and entitlement. Little did either of them know, his actions did not go unnoticed. Among the stunned passengers, a mysterious stranger watched silently, and his presence was about to change everything. As tension filled the air and other passengers shifted uncomfortably, the scene was set for an unexpected confrontation. What happened next would send shockwaves far beyond the confines of that city bus. But who was this unassuming observer, and why did his presence matter so much? The late afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the bustling bus station in the heart of a mid-sized American city. The air was thick with the acrid smell of exhaust fumes, mingling with the earthy scent of spring that struggled to break through. A cacophony of urban life filled the air, the low rumble of idling engines, the chatter of impatient commuters, and the occasional honk of a frustrated driver. Among the sea of weary faces stood Shayla, a young black woman of 28, her hand resting gently on her swollen belly. At 7 months pregnant, she had become a familiar sight at this station, her daily commute a testament to her determination to maintain her independence for as long as possible. Shayla shifted her weight from one foot to the other, trying to ease the ache in her lower back. The long day on her feet had taken its toll, and she longed for the comfort of her small apartment. But beneath the fatigue that etched lines around her eyes, there was an unmistakable spark of strength and determination. As she waited, Shayla's mind wandered to the events of her day. The Children's Center had been particularly busy, with a new group of kids joining their program. She smiled, remembering the shy smiles of the newcomers as they slowly warmed up to their new environment. One little girl with pigtails and a gap-toothed grin had clung to Shayla's side all day, finding comfort in her gentle presence. The connection had been instant, reminding Shayla why she loved her job so much despite its challenges. Her thoughts then turned to the challenges that lay ahead. The promotion she'd recently received at work was a source of both pride and anxiety. She was eager to prove herself, to show that her impending motherhood wouldn't impact her ability to excel in her career. But doubts crept in, unbidden. How would she balance the demands of her job with the needs of her newborn? Her partner's late-shift work meant she'd be navigating many of these challenges alone, at least in the immediate future. Shayla's hand moved in small, soothing circles over her belly, a gesture that had become almost unconscious over the past months. She felt a flutter of movement beneath her palm and smiled. Her baby was active today, perhaps picking up on her mix of emotions. She took a deep breath, inhaling the warm spring air, and tried to push her worries aside. One day at a time, she reminded herself. That's all anyone can do. Her gaze drifted to the other waiting passengers, landing on a middle-aged woman she'd seen at the stop before. The woman, Linda, stood a few feet away, her attention fixed on her phone. She was dressed in business casual attire, a pencil skirt and blazer that spoke of an office job, possibly middle management. As if sensing Shayla's gaze, Linda looked up, offering a kind smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. Shayla returned the smile, feeling a small wave of comfort wash over her. There was something about Linda's presence that put her at ease. Perhaps it was the way she carried herself, with the quiet confidence of someone who had weathered her own storms and come out stronger for it. What Shayla didn't know was that Linda was indeed a kindred spirit in many ways. A single mother with grown children, Linda had faced her own struggles balancing work and family. Now, as she stood at the bus stop each day, she often found her thoughts turning to Shayla, silently cheering on the young mother-to-be. Linda's phone buzzed with a text from her daughter, sharing exciting news about a job interview. Pride swelled in her chest as she typed a quick, encouraging response. Her journey as a single mother hadn't been easy, but moments like these made it all worthwhile. She glanced up at Shayla again, wondering about the young woman's story and hoping she had a strong support system. As Shayla continued to observe her surroundings, She noticed a group of teenagers nearby, their laughter and animated chatter a stark contrast to the general weariness of the adult commuters. One of the teens, a girl with vibrant blue hair, caught Shayla's eye and offered a friendly smile. Shayla returned the smile, feeling a small connection in this sea of strangers. The blue-haired girl, Zoe, nudged her friend and whispered, "That lady looks like my art teacher, Ms. Johnson. Remember? The one who's having a baby." Her friend nodded, and they both stole another glance at Shayla, their young faces a mix of curiosity and admiration. The familiar faces at the bus stop provided a sense of community, however fleeting. There was the elderly man who always had his nose buried in a well-worn paperback, the group of boisterous teenagers fresh out of school, and the harried-looking woman juggling a briefcase and a take-out coffee. Each day, they came together in this liminal space, sharing nothing more than a few minutes and a common destination. Today, the elderly man with the paperback, George, was particularly engrossed in his novel. It was a mystery he'd read countless times before, but he found comfort in the familiar twists and turns of the plot. His arthritis was acting up, making his hands ache as he gripped the book, but he wouldn't dream of giving up this daily pleasure. The harried woman with the briefcase and coffee, Sarah, was mentally rehearsing a presentation she had to give first thing in the morning. Her promotion to senior account manager hinged on this presentation, and the pressure was palpable. She took a sip of her coffee, grimacing at the bitter taste. In her rush, she'd forgotten to add sugar. But today there was a new face in the crowd, one that stood out not for its familiarity, but for the palpable aura of irritation that surrounded it. Jared, a middle-aged man in his mid-40s, stood apart from the other commuters, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the casual attire of those around him. The suit, normally impeccable, was slightly rumpled, as if its wearer had been through an unexpectedly trying day. Jared's presence at the bus stop was an anomaly, a fact that was evident in every line of his tense body. His eyes darted between his watch and the road, each glance accompanied by an impatient huff. Under his breath, he muttered a steady stream of complaints, his words just loud enough to catch the attention of those nearest to him. "Incompetent mechanics," he grumbled, checking his watch for the umpteenth time. "Entire day wasted. If I miss that meeting because of this." The other commuters gave Jared a wide berth, instinctively sensing his foul mood. His body language screamed, "Keep away," from his crossed arms to the scowl etched deeply on his face. It was clear that Jared considered himself above this situation, above the need to rely on public transportation. What the other passengers couldn't know was the series of events that had led Jared to this moment. As a senior manager at a prestigious firm, Jared was used to being in control, to having things go his way. The unexpected breakdown of his luxury car had thrown his carefully ordered world into chaos. Forced to leave his vehicle at a repair shop, he now found himself thrust into a world he considered beneath him, the world of public transportation. But it wasn't just the inconvenience of a broken-down car that fueled Jared's anger. Beneath the surface simmered a cauldron of resentment and bitterness. A recent divorce had left him feeling wronged and misunderstood, his sense of control over his life shaken to its core. The enforced humility of taking the bus was just the latest in a series of blows to his ego, each one chipping away at the carefully constructed image of success he'd built for himself. As Jared stood there seething, his mind replayed the events of the day. The argument with his ex-wife over alimony payments, the condescending tone of the mechanic as he explained the extensive repairs needed for the car, the missed lunch meeting with a potential client. Each memory stoked the fire of his anger, making him oblivious to the discomfort he was causing those around him. As the minutes ticked by, the tension at the bus stop grew. The regular commuters, accustomed to the ebb and flow of rush hour, noticed the shift in atmosphere brought about by Jared's presence. Conversations grew quieter, glances more furtive. Even the usually boisterous teenagers seemed subdued, their laughter muted. Zoe, the blue-haired teen, whispered to her friend, "What's that guy's problem? He looks like he's about to explode." Her friend shrugged. both of them stealing glances at Jared while trying to appear nonchalant. Linda, the middle-aged woman, found herself unconsciously stepping closer to Shayla, as if to offer some kind of protection from Jared's negative energy. She'd dealt with men like him before in her corporate job and recognized the signs of a brewing storm. Shayla, still lost in her own thoughts, was only vaguely aware of the change in mood. Her focus was inward, on the small movements of the life growing inside her, on the ache in her feet, on the long ride home that lay ahead. She noticed Jared, of course. It was hard not to, but she didn't give him much thought beyond a fleeting hope that whatever was troubling him would resolve itself soon. As the familiar rumble of an approaching bus filled the air, a ripple of movement passed through the waiting crowd. People began to gather their belongings, to shift closer to the curb. Shayla took a deep breath, bracing herself for the press of bodies and the struggle for seats that always accompanied the arrival of the bus. George, the elderly man, carefully marked his place in his book and tucked it into his worn leather satchel. Sarah, the harried businesswoman, gulped down the last of her coffee and tossed the cup into a nearby trash bin. The teenagers gathered their backpacks, their earlier subdued behavior giving way to excitement at the prospect of finally heading home. The bus pulled up to the stop with a hiss of brakes, its doors opening to disgorge a handful of passengers before the waiting crowd began to board. Jared, his impatience finally finding an outlet, pushed forward, elbowing past George in his haste to be first on the bus. The elderly man stumbled, nearly dropping his satchel, and Linda reached out to steady him, shooting a disapproving look at Jared's retreating back. Shayla hung back, one hand protectively cradling her belly, the other steadying herself against a nearby signpost. She watched as the other passengers filed onto the bus, each person disappearing into its interior. Linda, the kind-faced woman, paused at the door of the bus, glancing back at Shayla with a look of concern. For a moment, it seemed she might wait, might offer to help Shayla board. But then the press of people behind her urged her forward, and she disappeared into the bus with an apologetic smile. Finally, it was Shayla's turn. She took another deep breath, squared her shoulders, and stepped onto the bus. As she made her way down the aisle, she couldn't help but hope that today might be the day she'd find an empty seat, a small mercy for her tired feet and aching back. But as her eyes scanned the rows of occupied seats, that hope began to fade. Little did Shayla know that this ordinary commute, this daily ritual she had performed countless times before, was about to become anything but ordinary. The events that would unfold over the next hour would challenge her, surprise her, and ultimately remind her of both the cruelty and kindness that exist in the world. As she made her way down the aisle of the bus, searching for a seat, Shayla was unknowingly stepping into a situation that would ripple out far beyond this single bus ride, touching lives and sparking consequences she could never have imagined. The interior of the bus was a stark contrast to the open air of the bus stop. Here the atmosphere was close and stuffy, the warmth of too many bodies in too small a space, creating a palpable sense of discomfort. The low hum of conversations mingled with the rumble of the engine, creating a constant background noise that seemed to press in from all sides. Shayla made her way slowly down the aisle, one hand steadying herself against the seats as the bus lurched into motion. Her other hand remained protectively cupped around her swollen belly, a reflexive gesture of care for the life growing within. Her eyes scanned the rows of seats, hope dimming with each occupied spot she passed. The bus was a microcosm of the city itself, its passengers a diverse mix of people from all walks of life. There were students with backpacks stuffed full of books and dreams, their young faces a mix of exhaustion and determination. Office workers in various states of dishevelment sat next to service industry employees, still in their uniforms, all united in their eagerness to get home after a long day. Near the front of the bus, a young mother struggled to quiet her fussing toddler. The child's cries pierced through the general murmur of the bus, drawing looks of sympathy and annoyance in equal measure. The mother, her face etched with exhaustion, murmured soothing words to her child, all too aware of the attention they were drawing. A few rows back, an elderly couple sat hand in hand. their weathered faces bearing identical expressions of contentment. They had been riding this same bus route together for decades, a daily ritual that had long ago become a cherished part of their shared life. Zoe, the blue-haired teenager, had managed to snag a seat near the back of the bus. She sat with her backpack on her lap, one earbud in as she bobbed her head slightly to music only she could hear. Her eyes, lined with expertly applied eyeliner, darted occasionally to Shayla, tracking her progress down the aisle. As Shayla moved further down the aisle, she couldn't help but notice Jared, the agitated man from the bus stop. He had claimed a window seat, his body language radiating a clear message. Stay away. His briefcase occupied the aisle seat next to him, an effective barrier against any potential seatmates. Jared's attention was fixed on his phone, his fingers tapping out an aggressive rhythm as he presumably fired off emails or messages, each tap a physical manifestation of his continuing frustration. Jared's mind was a whirlwind of angry thoughts. The email he was composing to his boss was full of thinly veiled excuses for his absence from the important client meeting. He was acutely aware of how this day's events could impact his standing at the firm. The thought of losing his position, of seeing the respect he'd worked so hard to earn slip away, only fueled his anger. Shayla hesitated as she approached Jared's row. The seat next to him was one of the few remaining, and her feet ached with an intensity that made the prospect of standing for the entire ride almost unbearable. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage, and spoke. "Excuse me," Shayla said, her voice gentle but clear above the ambient noise of the bus. "Do you mind if I sit here?" For a moment, Jared didn't respond. His eyes remained fixed on his phone, his fingers continuing their staccato dance across the screen. Shayla waited, shifting her weight from one swollen foot to the other, hoping that Jared simply hadn't heard her over the noise of the bus. Finally, without looking up, Jared responded. His voice was curt, dismissive. "No," he said flatly. "Find somewhere else." The words hung in the air between them, sharp and unexpected. Shayla blinked, taken aback by the bluntness of the refusal. She glanced around, noting that the few remaining seats were rapidly filling as more passengers boarded the bus. "There aren't many seats left," Shayla explained, her voice firmer now but still polite. She gestured to her pregnant belly, a silent explanation of her need. "Could you please let me sit?" Jared's response was to shift in his seat, spreading his legs wider, claiming even more space. He muttered something under his breath, the words just loud enough for Shayla to hear, but quiet enough that he could pretend they weren't directed at her. "Always expecting something for nothing," he sneered. The words stung, their implicit racism a slap in the face. Shayla flinched, feeling as if she'd been physically struck. She bit her lip, blinking rapidly to hold back the tears that suddenly threatened to fall. Her hand moved instinctively to her belly, as if to shield her unborn child from Jared's hostility. For a moment, Shayla considered arguing, considered pointing out the basic human decency of offering a seat to a pregnant woman. But the coldness in Jared's eyes, the rigid set of his jaw, told her it would be futile. Instead, she turned away, moving to stand in the aisle, one hand gripping a handrail as the bus swayed and lurched through city traffic. The interaction, brief as it was, didn't go unnoticed by the other passengers. A ripple of discomfort spread through the bus. Some passengers pointedly looked away, burying their faces in books or phones, unwilling to get involved. Others exchanged uneasy glances, their discomfort with the situation evident in their furrowed brows and tight lips. Linda, the middle-aged woman from the bus stop, had witnessed the entire exchange. She half rose from her seat, concern etched on her face, clearly torn between wanting to help Shayla and not wanting to escalate the situation. In the end, she settled back into her seat, her eyes filled with a mix of sympathy and frustration as she watched Shayla struggle to maintain her balance. The young mother with the fussing toddler looked up, her own troubles momentarily forgotten as she witnessed Shayla's plight. She bounced her child on her knee, a gesture of comfort that seemed as much for herself as for her child, her eyes darting between Shayla and Jared with a mix of empathy and indignation. Zoe, the blue-haired teenager, felt a surge of anger at Jared's behavior. She leaned over to her friend, whispering furiously, "Did you see that? What a jerk!" Her friend nodded, both of them shooting daggers with their eyes at the back of Jared's head. George, the elderly man with the paperback, peered over the top of his book, his bushy eyebrows furrowed in disapproval. He'd lived through decades of social change and progress, and seeing such blatant disrespect brought a bitter taste to his mouth. He thought of his own daughter, now grown with children of her own, and felt a protective instinct surge within him. As the bus continued its journey through the city streets, the atmosphere remained tense. Shayla stood uncomfortably in the aisle, one hand gripping the handrail, the other supporting her lower back. The physical strain of standing was evident on her face, but she remained silent, not wanting to draw any more attention to herself. Jared, for his part, seemed oblivious to the discomfort he had caused. He continued to tap away at his phone, his face set in a scowl. Occasionally he would mutter under his breath, bits and pieces of his ongoing frustration, escaping into the charged atmosphere of the bus. The other passengers continued to react in their own ways. An elderly woman a few seats ahead kept glancing back at Shayla, concern evident in her rheumy eyes. A group of teenagers further back whispered among themselves, shooting disapproving looks at Jared. Yet no one spoke up, no one intervened. The unwritten rules of public transportation, mind your own business, avoid confrontation, held firm, even in the face of such blatant unkindness. As the bus navigated through evening traffic, lurching and swaying, Shayla struggled to maintain her balance. Each sudden stop or sharp turn sent a jolt of discomfort through her body. She closed her eyes, trying to center herself, to find a calm place amidst the physical discomfort and emotional turmoil. In her mind, Shayla reached for the strength that had carried her through other challenges. She thought of her mother, who had raised her alone, working multiple jobs to provide opportunities for her daughter. She thought of her own journey, the late nights studying, the long hours at work, the sacrifices made to build a better life for herself and now, for her child. She had faced adversity before, had stood strong in the face of prejudice and doubt. This moment, difficult as it was, would not break her. Yet even as Shayla found her inner resolve, the weight of the situation pressed down on her. It wasn't just the physical discomfort of standing, or even the sting of Jared's rudeness. It was the accumulated weight of 1,000 small indignities, a lifetime of having to prove herself worthy of basic respect and consideration. In this moment, on this crowded bus, Shayla felt the full force of that burden. As the bus continued its journey, the tension showed no signs of dissipating. If anything, it seemed to grow with each passing minute, with each lurch and sway of the vehicle. The air felt thick with unspoken words, with the collective discomfort of passengers witnessing an injustice but unsure how to address it. Linda, the middle-aged woman who had smiled at Shayla earlier, felt her resolve strengthening. She had spent years in corporate environments, navigating difficult personalities and standing up for herself and others. The memory of her own struggles as a young mother, trying to balance work and family, fueled her growing determination to act. Zoe, the blue-haired teenager, was having a heated text conversation with her friends about the situation. Her thumbs flew across her phone screen as she vented her frustration and anger, her friends responding with a flurry of outraged emojis and suggestions for confronting Jared. George, the elderly man with the paperback, had long since given up on reading. His book lay forgotten in his lap as he watched the scene unfold, his weathered hands clenched in quiet anger. He thought of the civil rights movement he had witnessed in his youth, of the progress made and the battles still to be fought. The injustice he was witnessing now felt like a step backwards, and it weighed heavily on his heart. The young mother with the toddler had managed to quiet her child, but her own agitation was growing. She bounced her knee nervously, her eyes flicking between Shayla and Jared, an internal battle raging between her desire to help and her fear of confrontation. It was at this moment that an elderly woman, who had been watching the situation unfold with growing concern, decided she could no longer remain silent. With trembling hands gripping a worn wooden cane, she began to rise from her seat. Her movements were slow and deliberate. Each inch gained a testament to her determination. The woman, well into her 70s, had the kind of face that spoke of a life fully lived, deep lines etched around eyes that still sparkled with warmth and intelligence. Her clothes were simple but neat, a floral blouse paired with comfortable slacks, the outfit of someone who prioritized practicality over fashion. As she struggled to her feet, those seated nearby noticed her efforts. A young man in a college sweatshirt half rose from his seat, ready to offer assistance, but the elderly woman waved him off with a gentle smile. This was something she needed to do herself. Finally upright, she took a moment to steady herself before addressing Shayla. Her voice, though softened by age, carried clearly through the bus. "Here, sweetheart," she said gently. "You shouldn't be standing in your condition. Take my seat." The bus seemed to collectively hold its breath. Shayla, caught off guard by this unexpected act of kindness, felt a lump form in her throat. She opened her mouth to speak, but for a moment, no words came out. When she finally found her voice, it was thick with emotion. "Thank you," Shayla said softly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "But I'll be okay. Please keep your seat. I couldn't possibly—" The elderly woman's kind offer had cracked the shell of stoic endurance Shayla had built around herself. The contrast between this stranger's compassion and Jared's callousness was stark, highlighting the injustice of the situation in a way that mere words couldn't have. The other passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The elderly woman's actions had shone a spotlight on their own inaction, forcing them to confront their complicity in allowing the situation to continue. Some looked away, unable to meet Shayla's eyes, while others glared openly at Jared, their disapproval no longer hidden. Linda felt a surge of shame and admiration, shame for not having acted sooner, and admiration for the elderly woman's courage. She straightened in her seat, her own resolve strengthening. Zoe and her friends watched the scene unfold with a mix of awe and anticipation. The blue-haired teen felt a newfound respect for the older generation, realizing that activism and standing up for what's right wasn't limited to the young. Jared, for his part, seemed to grow even more defiant in the face of this silent condemnation. He sat up straighter, puffing out his chest, his sense of entitlement visibly growing. It was as if the elderly woman's offer of kindness had only served to reinforce his belief in his own righteousness. Unable to contain himself any longer, Jared raised his voice, ensuring that the entire bus could hear him. "This is what's wrong with the world," he announced loudly, his words dripping with disdain. "People like her think they deserve special treatment, can't even stand for a few minutes without expecting someone to give them a handout." The offensive comment hung in the air, and for a moment the bus fell utterly silent. The only sounds were the rumble of the engine and the distant honking of cars outside. It was as if Jared's words had sucked all the air out of the vehicle, leaving everyone stunned and breathless. Shayla, still standing near Jared's seat, felt her cheeks burn with a mixture of shame and anger. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, unwilling to meet the gazes of the other passengers, afraid of what she might see there. Pity, disgust, or worst of all, agreement with Jared's sentiments. The young mother, who had been watching the scene unfold, gasped audibly, instinctively covering her child's ears as if to protect them from Jared's toxic words. The toddler, sensing their mother's distress, began to whimper softly. George, the elderly man, felt his hands shaking with suppressed rage. He had lived through decades of progress, had seen the slow but steady march towards equality. To hear such blatant prejudice voiced so openly in 2024 filled him with a mix of anger and despair. Linda gripped her phone tightly, her knuckles turning white. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, her internal struggle visible on her face. She wanted to say something, to stand up for Shayla, but fear held her back. Fear of confrontation, fear of making the situation worse, fear of becoming a target herself. The elderly woman who had offered her seat slowly sank back down, her expression a mixture of sadness and disappointment. She reached out a gnarled hand towards Shayla, as if trying to offer comfort from a distance, but the gesture went unnoticed as Shayla continued to stare at the floor. Zoe, the blue-haired teenager, felt tears of frustration pricking at her eyes. She had always considered herself an ally, someone who would speak up in the face of injustice. But now, faced with a real-world test of her principles, she found herself frozen, unsure of how to react. The atmosphere in the bus had shifted from uncomfortable to unbearable. The air felt electric, charged with tension and the potential for further conflict. Everyone seemed to be waiting for someone else to make a move, to say something, to somehow diffuse the situation. It was at this precise moment, as the tension reached its peak, that a new voice cut through the silence. "You think you've earned that seat?" The words, calm but carrying an undercurrent of steel, came from the back of the bus. Heads turned, searching for the source of the voice. There, rising from his seat with fluid grace that spoke of military training, stood a young man in uniform. Ethan, for that was his name, moved purposefully down the aisle, his presence immediately commanding attention. Ethan was in his early 20s with close-cropped hair and the kind of physique that comes from rigorous physical training. His uniform was impeccable, every crease sharp, every button polished. But it was his eyes that drew attention, clear, focused, and filled with a quiet determination. As Ethan made his way towards Jared, the other passengers instinctively moved aside, creating a path. The bus had fallen silent again, but this time it was a silence filled with anticipation rather than shock. Jared, surprised by Ethan's approach, stiffened in his seat. For the first time since he'd boarded the bus, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. He straightened his tie, a nervous gesture that betrayed his discomfort. Ethan stopped beside Jared's seat, his voice steady and controlled as he addressed him. "What exactly have you done to deserve it?" he asked, his tone making it clear that this was not a casual inquiry, but a challenge. The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. The other passengers watched intently, the atmosphere electric with anticipation. In this moment, it felt as if more than just a seat on a bus was at stake. It was as if, in this mundane setting of a city bus, a battle was about to be fought over something much larger, over basic human decency, over respect, over the kind of society we choose to create with our daily actions. As Jared opened his mouth to respond, the tension in the bus reached a fever pitch. Whatever happened next would undoubtedly change the course of the evening, and perhaps even lives, in ways no one could have predicted. The confrontation that had been brewing since Jared first refused to give up his seat was about to come to a head, forcing everyone on board to confront their own beliefs, prejudices, and capacity for kindness. The air on the bus crackled with tension as Jared, faced with Ethan's direct challenge, struggled to regain his composure. For a moment, he seemed at a loss for words, his mouth opening and closing without sound. He was used to being the one in control, the one asking the tough questions. Being on the receiving end of such a direct confrontation was unfamiliar territory, and it showed in the slight tremor of his hands as he adjusted his tie. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, Jared's face contorted with renewed anger and defiance. His earlier uncertainty gave way to a surge of indignation. Who was this young upstart to question him? The very audacity of it fueled his response. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Jared snapped, his voice rising in pitch and volume. He half rose from his seat, using his slight height advantage to try and intimidate Ethan. "You think because you're in uniform I'm supposed to care what you say? I don't owe her, or you, anything." The other passengers recoiled at the venom in Jared's voice. The young mother instinctively tightened her hold on her child, while George, the elderly man, gripped the edge of his seat so hard his knuckles turned white. Zoe, the blue-haired teenager, felt a mix of fear and excitement course through her veins. This was real-life drama unfolding before her eyes, far more intense than any reality TV show. Ethan didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his posture relaxed but alert, a stark contrast to Jared's aggressive stance. His military training was evident in his calm demeanor, his ability to remain composed in the face of hostility. When he spoke, his voice remained steady and measured, but there was an underlying strength to his words that commanded attention. "You don't owe her anything?" Ethan repeated, his eyebrow raised slightly. His gaze briefly flicked to Shayla, still standing uncomfortably in the aisle before returning to Jared. "She's carrying more than you ever have. You don't even know what real sacrifice looks like." A collective intake of breath swept through the bus. Passengers exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement with Ethan's words, others looking uncomfortable but riveted by the unfolding drama. Linda, the middle-aged woman, felt a surge of admiration for the young soldier. This was the kind of courage she'd always hoped she'd have in such a situation. Jared's face flushed a deeper shade of red, his anger visibly mounting. The veins in his neck stood out as he struggled to control his temper. He was used to being respected, deferred to. This public challenge to his authority, his very worldview, was more than he could bear. "I work hard for what I have," he insisted, his voice rising to a near shout. Spittle flew from his lips as he spoke, his composure crumbling. "No one gave me a handout. Why should I give up my comfort for someone else's poor planning?" The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, looking away. Jared's sentiment, though crudely expressed, wasn't entirely foreign to them. How many times had they walked past a homeless person, averting their eyes? How often had they chosen comfort over compassion? Shayla, still standing nearby, felt each word like a physical blow. Her hand instinctively moved to her belly, as if to shield her unborn child from the hostility. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she blinked them back furiously. She wouldn't give Jared the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Ethan's response was swift and resolute. His voice, though still calm, carried an edge of steel that cut through Jared's bluster. "Real men stand up for others," he stated firmly, "not against them. Your comfort doesn't outweigh her need or basic human decency." The words seemed to echo in the sudden silence that followed. It was as if Ethan had articulated something that everyone had been feeling but couldn't express. The simplicity and truth of his statement hung in the air, impossible to ignore or refute. As the argument intensified, the other passengers began to react more openly. Murmurs of agreement with Ethan rippled through the bus. The elderly woman who had offered her seat earlier nodded vigorously, her eyes shining with approval. A group of teenagers towards the back of the bus started a slow clap, quickly silenced by sharp looks from the adults around them. George, the elderly man, felt a lump in his throat. Ethan's words had transported him back to his youth, to the civil rights movement he had witnessed, but never fully participated in. He had always told himself that if he had been younger, braver, he would have stood up. Now, watching this young soldier, he felt a mix of admiration and regret. Zoe, the blue-haired teenager, was furiously texting her friends, providing a play-by-play of the confrontation. Her earlier fear had given way to excitement and a growing sense of witnessing something important. This, she thought, was what standing up for your beliefs looked like in real life. Jared, realizing he was rapidly losing whatever high ground he thought he had, began to sputter incoherently. His earlier confidence had evaporated, leaving behind a man desperately trying to cling to his sense of superiority. "You don't know me," he stammered. "You don't know what I've been through. I've earned my place." But his words rang hollow even to his own ears. He looked around the bus, seeing nothing but disapproval and disgust directed his way. The carefully constructed image he had of himself, successful, respected, in control, was crumbling before his eyes. It was at this moment that Linda, the middle-aged woman who had been wrestling with her conscience, finally found her courage. She stood up abruptly, her movement drawing all eyes to her. With determined steps, she approached Shayla. "Here," Linda said firmly, gently touching Shayla's arm. "You can have my seat. Don't worry about him." Her voice trembled slightly, but her resolve was clear in the set of her jaw and the straightness of her spine. Shayla, emotionally drained but grateful, accepted the offer this time. Relief washed over her face as she sank into the seat, exhaling deeply. She looked up at Linda with a watery smile, a silent thank you passing between them. This quiet act of kindness seemed to punctuate the confrontation, underlining the decency that Jared had refused to show. It was as if Linda's action had broken a spell, releasing the other passengers from their paralysis of inaction. One by one, other passengers began to speak up. The young mother, bouncing her now calm toddler on her knee, shared her own story of struggling through pregnancy while working. An older man in a construction worker's outfit gruffly offered Shayla a bottle of water from his lunchbox. Even Zoe, overcoming her initial hesitation, leaned forward to offer Shayla her phone charger, just in case she needed it. These small acts of kindness, insignificant on their own, began to build upon each other. The atmosphere in the bus shifted, the earlier tension giving way to a sense of community, of shared humanity. Jared, watching this transformation, felt the last of his anger drain away, replaced by a creeping sense of shame. His face, once flushed with rage, now paled as the full impact of his actions began to sink in. He looked around the bus, seeing himself through the eyes of the other passengers, and for the first time, he didn't like what he saw. Ethan, sensing that his point had been made, took a step back. He remained standing, a silent force of moral authority, while the other passengers continued their small acts of kindness towards Shayla. As the bus continued its journey, the atmosphere slowly began to shift. The oppressive silence that had reigned during the confrontation gave way to a low murmur of conversation. Some passengers offered words of support to Shayla, while others discussed the incident in hushed tones, processing what they had witnessed. Ethan, his duty done, began to make his way back to his seat at the rear of the bus. As he passed Shayla, she reached out and touched his arm lightly. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded, a small smile softening his features. "It's what anyone should have done," he replied, before continuing to his seat. Jared remained in his seat, his earlier bravado completely deflated. He stared straight ahead, avoiding eye contact with anyone, the weight of public disapproval heavy on his shoulders. The transformation from his earlier arrogance to this defeated posture was stark, a visual representation of the power of collective action against injustice. As the bus rumbled on through the evening traffic, there was a sense that something significant had occurred. It wasn't just about a seat on a bus, or even about one man's racist behavior. It was about a group of strangers coming together, however hesitantly at first, to stand up for what was right. It was a reminder that small acts of kindness and courage can ripple out, affecting more than just the immediate participants. For Shayla, sitting now with a hand resting on her belly, the events of the evening were a mixed blessing. While the confrontation had been uncomfortable and even frightening at times, the support she had received, from Ethan's bold stand to Linda's quiet offer of a seat, had restored some of her faith in humanity. As she gazed out the window at the passing city lights, she felt a renewed sense of hope for the world her child would be born into. The other passengers, too, seemed changed by the experience. There was a newfound camaraderie among them, a sense of shared experience that transcended their differences. Conversations sprang up between strangers, discussing what they had witnessed and sharing their own experiences of prejudice and kindness. Linda, back in her standing position, felt a sense of pride and relief. She had finally found the courage to act on her convictions, and the weight of her earlier inaction lifted from her shoulders. She made a silent promise to herself to be braver in the future, to not let fear hold her back from doing what was right. Zoe, the blue-haired teenager, had stopped texting and was instead engaged in an animated conversation with the elderly woman who had first offered her seat. The generational gap between them seemed to have disappeared, united as they were by their shared experience and their admiration for Ethan's bravery. Even George, the elderly man with the paperback, felt a renewed sense of hope. He had lived long enough to see significant social progress, but also long enough to become somewhat cynical about human nature. Tonight's events had reminded him that courage and kindness were still alive and well, even in unexpected places. As the bus neared its next stop, there was a sense of reluctance among the passengers. This shared experience had created a bond, however temporary, and no one seemed eager for it to end. Jared, still silent in his seat, seemed lost in thought. The man who had boarded the bus full of self-importance and anger now sat deflated, his worldview shaken. As the bus slowed to a stop, he stood up abruptly. Without meeting anyone's eyes, he made his way to the door, leaving behind not just the bus, but perhaps also some of his long-held prejudices. As Jared stepped off the bus, there was a collective exhalation, as if the entire bus had been holding its breath. The door closed behind him with a soft hiss, and as the bus pulled away, there was a sense of a chapter closing. Little did anyone on the bus know, but the consequences of this evening's events were far from over. For Jared in particular, this was just the beginning of a reckoning that would shake the foundations of his life. As the bus journey neared its end, an uneasy calm had settled over the passengers. The confrontation between Ethan and Jared felt like a distant storm, its thunder still echoing in their minds, but the immediate danger passed. Shayla sat in the seat offered by Linda, her eyes closed, one hand resting protectively on her belly. The gentle sway of the bus seemed to lull her into a state of peaceful exhaustion, the stress of the earlier conflict slowly ebbing away. Jared had departed at the previous stop, but his presence still lingered in the collective consciousness of the bus riders. Occasionally, someone would glance at the now empty seat he had occupied, as if expecting to see him there, scowling and defiant. But the seat remained empty, a silent reminder of the drama that had unfolded. Ethan had returned to his seat at the back of the bus, but he kept a watchful eye on the other passengers, particularly Shayla. His military training had instilled in him a sense of responsibility that extended beyond the immediate confrontation. He wanted to ensure that Shayla made it to her destination safely, that no further incidents would mar her journey. The other passengers, while no longer actively engaged in the drama, remained hyper-aware of their surroundings. Conversations were muted, often punctuated by significant glances towards Shayla or the empty seat Jared had left behind. The elderly woman who had initially offered her seat kept turning in her chair to check on Shayla, her weathered face creased with concern. Linda, who had given up her seat to Shayla, stood nearby, one hand gripping an overhead rail. She seemed lost in thought, perhaps reflecting on her own journey from silent disapproval to active intervention. Occasionally, she would catch Shayla's eye and offer a small, reassuring smile. As the bus wound its way through the darkening city streets, the atmosphere inside remained charged with unresolved tension. It was as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. But nothing further happened. No more words were exchanged. No more confrontations erupted. Finally, the bus began to slow as it approached Shayla's stop. She stirred, opening her eyes and gathering her belongings. As she stood, several passengers moved to help her, their earlier reluctance to get involved now replaced by an almost overcompensating eagerness to assist. Shayla made her way to the front of the bus, supported by Linda and the elderly woman who had first offered her seat. As she reached the door, she turned back to face the other passengers. For a moment she hesitated, unsure of what to say. Then, with a soft smile, she simply said, "Thank you, all of you." The words hung in the air as Shayla stepped off the bus. The doors closed behind her with a soft hiss, and the bus pulled away from the curb. Inside, the passengers exchanged glances, a mix of emotions playing across their faces: relief, pride, lingering anger at Jared's behavior, and a shared sense of having been part of something important. What Jared didn't know as he had walked away from the bus, his mind undoubtedly replaying the humiliating confrontation, was that his ordeal was far from over. The consequences of his actions on the bus were about to ripple out far beyond this single incident, setting in motion a chain of events that would shake the very foundations of his life. Ethan, still seated at the back of the bus, allowed himself a small smile. He knew something that Jared didn't, something that would make this evening's events more than just an unpleasant memory for the arrogant businessman. The other passengers, relieved that the tense situation had passed, began to relax. Some struck up conversations with their neighbors, discussing the events they had witnessed. Others simply sat in thoughtful silence, perhaps considering how they might have acted differently, or how they might respond if faced with a similar situation in the future. As the bus continued on its route, the city lights blurring past the windows, there was a sense of an ending. but also of a beginning. The immediate drama had passed, but its effects would continue to ripple outward, touching lives in ways that no one on that bus could have predicted. The next morning dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the turbulent events of the previous evening. Jared awoke with a start, the memory of his humiliation on the bus still fresh in his mind. He lay in bed for a moment, hoping against hope that it had all been a bad dream. But the knot in his stomach and the lingering feeling of shame told him otherwise. With a groan, Jared dragged himself out of bed and began his morning routine. As he knotted his tie and smoothed down his shirt, he tried to shake off the unease that clung to him. He was determined to put the incident behind him, to return to his normal life where he was respected and in control. "It's over," he muttered to himself as he grabbed his briefcase and headed out the door. "No one at work knows about it. It's just another day." But as Jared would soon discover, the universe had other plans. The office was buzzing with its usual morning energy when Jared arrived. He nodded curtly to the receptionist and made his way to his corner office, his steps quickening as he neared his sanctuary. Just as he was about to close his office door behind him, a voice called out, "Jared." It was his assistant, Sarah. "Mr. Coleman wants everyone to join him for a coffee break in the conference room. He says it's important." Jared felt a flicker of excitement, quickly suppressing the lingering unease from the previous night. Mr. Coleman was the CEO, his boss. Probably another opportunity for Jared to shine in front of the team, to reinforce his authority and importance within the company. "Tell him I'll be right there," Jared replied, his voice steady and confident. As he made his way to the conference room, Jared noticed an unusual tension in the air. Colleagues who normally greeted him warmly were averting their eyes. Conversations hushed as he passed. The knot in his stomach tightened, but he pushed the feeling aside. He was Jared Thompson, senior manager. He had nothing to fear. Jared pushed open the conference room door with his usual assertiveness, ready to dominate whatever meeting lay ahead. But the sight that greeted him stopped him in his tracks. The entire team was already gathered, an unusual mix of tension and anticipation in the air. Mr. Coleman stood at the head of the table, his face a mask of barely contained anger, and there, off to one side, stood a familiar figure in military uniform, Ethan. The blood drained from Jared's face as the realization hit him. This wasn't about work at all. This was about last night. "Jared," Mr. Coleman's voice was cold. "Please join us. We need to discuss your conduct on public transportation yesterday evening." Jared's legs felt like lead as he made his way to an empty chair. His mind raced, trying to find a way out of this situation. How did they know? How could this be happening? Mr. Coleman didn't wait for Jared to settle. "What you may not have realized, Jared, is that my son Ethan was on that bus. He witnessed everything and told me about your deplorable behavior." The CEO's face softened for a moment, a hint of pride breaking through his stern demeanor. "My boy, always doing the right thing. That's the kind of integrity we expect from our soldiers, and frankly, from our employees too." Jared's eyes darted to Ethan, who met his gaze steadily without a hint of triumph or malice, just the same quiet strength he had displayed on the bus. "But we didn't just take Ethan's word for it," Mr. Coleman continued. He nodded to someone off camera, and suddenly, a video began playing on the large screen at the end of the conference room. Jared watched in horror as his own face filled the screen, his voice clearly audible as he refused to give up his seat to Shayla. The video, apparently taken by another passenger, captured every moment of his arrogant and racist behavior. As the video played, Jared's colleagues watched in silence, their expressions a mix of shock and revulsion. Jared felt himself shrinking in his seat, the weight of his actions crushing down on him. When the video ended, the silence in the room was deafening. Jared opened his mouth to speak, to offer some explanation or excuse, but no words came out. Mr. Coleman's voice, when he finally spoke, was heavy with disappointment. "Jared, I've known you for years. I trusted you. I promoted you. And this is how you conduct yourself. This is how you treat others when you think no one who matters is watching." Jared stuttered, trying to form a coherent response. It was a bad day. My car broke down. I was stressed. I didn't mean... But Mr. Coleman held up a hand, cutting him off. Save it, Jared. There's no excuse for this kind of behavior. Not in my company. Not in my family. The CEO's words hung in the air, their implication clear. Jared felt the floor dropping out from beneath him. Everything he had worked for, everything he had built, was crumbling before his eyes. Just as Jared thought the situation couldn't get any worse, one of his team members spoke up. Mr. Coleman, sir, the young woman said, her voice shaking slightly. This isn't an isolated incident. Suddenly it was as if a dam had broken. One by one, Jared's colleagues began to speak up, sharing stories of his bullying behavior, his casual racism, his abuse of power, stories of humiliation, of unfair treatment, of a toxic work environment that Jared had cultivated through his actions. Jared sat there, stunned, as his carefully constructed world came crashing down around him. He looked around the room, hoping to find a sympathetic face, someone who would speak up for him. But he was met with only cold stares and years of pent-up resentment. "You're fired, Jared," Mr. Coleman said firmly. "Effective immediately. HR will escort you to clear out your office." On shaky legs, Jared stood and made his way to the door. As he reached for the handle, he heard Mr. Coleman's voice one last time. "And Jared, I suggest you find an alternate mode of transportation home. I don't think you'll be welcome on the bus." The door closed behind Jared with a final sounding click. He stood in the hallway, feeling the curious and judgmental stares of his now former co-workers. The office, once his domain, now felt alien and hostile. The days following Jared's termination were a whirlwind of chaos and humiliation. Word of his behavior spread quickly through professional circles, his reputation tarnished beyond repair. Jared found himself not only jobless, but essentially unemployable. His name, once a symbol of success and authority, was now synonymous with racism and workplace bullying. Jared's carefully constructed world continued to crumble around him. The country club where he held a prestigious membership quietly informed him that his application for renewal had been indefinitely postponed. Even his favorite restaurants, where he had once been treated like royalty, suddenly found themselves fully booked whenever he tried to make a reservation. As the weeks turned into months, Jared's financial situation became increasingly dire. Unable to secure new employment, he found his savings dwindling rapidly. The expensive car he had once prized now sat in his garage, a painful reminder of the privilege he had taken for granted. He could no longer afford the payments and knew it was only a matter of time before it would be repossessed. In a cruel twist of irony, Jared found himself forced to rely on the very public transportation system he had once sneered at. Each bus ride was an exercise in paranoia and shame, as Jared constantly scanned the faces around him, wondering if he would be recognized, if someone would confront him. The man who had once commanded respect and fear in boardrooms now kept his head down, avoiding eye contact with his fellow passengers. The transformation was stark, from an arrogant executive to a humbled, broken man, all because of a moment of cruelty on a city bus. Meanwhile, life moved on for the others involved in the incident. Ethan continued his military service, his quiet act of standing up to injustice having far-reaching consequences he could never have imagined. His actions had not only exposed Jared's racism, but had also sparked important conversations about bystander intervention and moral courage within his unit and beyond. One day, as Ethan was on leave and visiting his hometown, he happened to encounter Shayla at a local community center. She was there for a prenatal class, her pregnancy now in its final stages. As soon as she saw Ethan, her face lit up with recognition. "It's you!" Shayla exclaimed, her hand resting on her swollen belly. "I never got the chance to properly thank you for what you did that day on the bus." Ethan smiled warmly, shaking his head. "There's no need to thank me. It was the right thing to do." Shayla's expression turned curious. "I always wondered what happened after. Did that man face any consequences for his behavior?" Ethan's smile turned slightly grim. "Justice was served," he said simply. "My father, it turns out, was his boss. Let's just say he won't be treating anyone like that again, on a bus or anywhere else. Shayla's eyes widened at this revelation. She felt a complex mix of emotions: relief that the man had faced consequences, sadness at the thought of anyone losing their job, but ultimately a sense of justice being served. "Thank you for telling me," Shayla said softly. "It's comforting to know that sometimes people do face consequences for their actions." As they parted ways, both Ethan and Shayla felt a sense of closure. The incident on the bus, painful as it had been, had led to positive change. It had exposed the ugly face of casual racism, sparked important conversations, and shown that standing up for what's right can have a real impact. The story of that fateful bus ride would continue to ripple out, touching lives in ways that none of the participants could have predicted. It served as a powerful reminder that our actions, no matter how small they may seem in the moment, can have far-reaching consequences, and that in the face of injustice, one person's courage can make all the difference. As night fell on the city, the bus that had been the stage for our story continued its journey. Just another vehicle in the bustling traffic, yet it carried with it a powerful tale of courage and consequence. The events of that day showed how a single moment of bravery can ripple out, touching lives in unexpected ways. It reminded us that in the face of injustice, one person's stand can make all the difference. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to my channel. Your support is what keeps me going, and I appreciate having you on this journey.